Karen Walters, the self-appointed president of the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association, HOA, stormed out of her immaculate suburban home, clutching a clipboard in one hand and her ever-present megaphone in the other. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and crisp business attire laid the fiery determination that burned within. "Attention, residents of Oakwood Hills," she bellowed through the megaphone, her voice cutting through the tranquil suburban air. "This is an emergency HOA meeting, and I demand that you all report to the community center immediately." Nearby, Karen's teenage son Connor was tossing a football with his friends in the front yard, oblivious to his mother's impending rampage. As the other residents cautiously emerged from their homes, Karen marched towards the group, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "You there, young man," she barked, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at Connor. "What do you think you're doing? This is not appropriate behavior for this neighborhood." Connor, taken aback by his mother's sudden outburst, stammered, "I am just playing with my friends, Mom." "What's the problem?" "The problem, young man, is that you are violating the HOA's strict guidelines on appropriate outdoor activities," Karen declared, her voice rising in pitch. "This is a family-friendly neighborhood, and we cannot have reckless behavior like this disrupting the peace." The other residents, sensing an impending confrontation, began to gather around the scene, murmuring amongst themselves. "But, Mom, we're just having fun," Connor protested, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Fun?" Karen scoffed, her lips curling into a disapproving sneer. "There is no room for fun in this community, young man. We have rules, and they must be followed to the letter." Suddenly, a voice from the crowd spoke up. Now, Karen, let's not get too carried away here. The kids are just playing, and it doesn't seem to be causing any harm." Karen whirled around, her eyes narrowing as she recognized the speaker. It was her longtime rival, Susan, the treasurer of the HOA. "Stay out of this, Susan," Karen snapped, her grip tightening on the megaphone. "This is my neighborhood, and I will not tolerate any insubordination or disregard for the rules." The tension in the air was palpable as the two women glared at each other, their long-standing feud once again coming to the forefront. Unbeknownst to Karen, however, a pair of watchful eyes were observing the unfolding scene from a nearby patrol car. It was none other than the police chief himself, who happened to be Connor's father. With a furrowed brow, he stepped out of the car, ready to intervene if necessary. As the standoff between Karen and Susan continued, the rest of the residents began to murmur and whisper among themselves, sensing the impending explosion. Karen, unwilling to back down, raised the megaphone to her lips once more. "Residents of Oakwood Hills, I demand that you all return to your homes immediately. This is a serious violation of the HOA's rules, and I will not tolerate it." Susan, undeterred, stepped forward and placed a hand on Karen's arm. "Karen, please, let's try to resolve this calmly. There's no need for such drastic measures." Karen jerked her arm away, her eyes blazing with fury. "Don't you dare tell me how to run this neighborhood, Susan. I'm the president of this HOA, and I will do whatever it takes to maintain order." The tension in the air was palpable, and the residents could feel the situation quickly spiraling out of control. Connor, sensing the impending conflict, tried to intervene. "Mom, please, let's just calm down and talk about this," he pleaded, his voice shaking slightly. But Karen was having none of it. "Stay out of this, Connor," she snapped, her attention still firmly fixed on Susan. "This is between me and the rest of the community." Suddenly, a new voice joined the fray. "What seems to be the problem here, folks?" All eyes turned towards the source of the voice, and the residents parted to reveal the imposing figure of the police chief, Connor's father. Karen's eyes widened in surprise, and for a brief moment, she seemed to hesitate. But her stubborn streak quickly reasserted itself, and she turned to face the police chief head-on. "Chief, thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "These residents are blatantly disregarding the HOA's rules, and I need your assistance in restoring order to this community." The police chief raised an eyebrow, his gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd. "Mom, I'm not sure I understand the situation here. It seems like these folks are just enjoying a bit of neighborhood fun." Karen's face flushed with indignation, and she opened her mouth to respond, but the police chief raised a hand to silence her. Now, let's all take a step back and try to resolve this in a calm and reasonable manner, he said, his voice measured and authoritative. As the residents watched the unfolding drama with bated breath, the tension in the air continued to build, setting the stage for an explosive confrontation that would test the limits of the community's cohesion. Karen, undeterred by the police chief's attempts at diplomatic intervention, was determined to assert her authority over the community. She took a deep breath and squared her shoulders, her grip tightening on the megaphone. Chief, with all due respect, these residents are flagrantly violating the HOA's rules, and it is my duty as the president to ensure that order is maintained, she said, her voice dripping with a false sense of authority. The police chief studied Karen for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Mom, I understand your concerns, but from what I can see, these folks are simply enjoying a bit of harmless fun. I don't believe any laws are being broken here. Karen's face contorted with a mix of frustration and desperation. But Chief, you don't understand. This is about the integrity of our community, the very fabric of our neighborhood. She paused, her eyes narrowing. If you won't help me enforce the rules, then I'll have to take matters into my own hands. Before the police chief could respond, Karen raised the megaphone to her lips once more and bellowed, "Attention, all Oakwood Hills HOA members. Report to the community center immediately. We have a situation that requires our full attention." The residents exchanged bewildered glances, unsure of how to react. Susan, sensing the escalation, stepped forward and placed a hand on Karen's arm. "Karen, please, let's think this through. There's no need to involve the whole HOA in this," she pleaded, her voice low and urgent. But Karen shrugged off Susan's attempt at diplomacy, her eyes alight with a manic determination. "This is my HOA, Susan, and I will do whatever it takes to protect it." As the minutes ticked by, Karen's reinforcements began to arrive, their faces set with a grim determination that mirrored their leaders. The police chief, realizing the situation was quickly spiraling out of control, reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Chief Weston. I need backup at the Oakwood Hills Community Center immediately. We've got a situation here that's about to get out of hand." The residents of Oakwood Hills watched with a mix of trepidation and curiosity as the events unfolded, their once peaceful neighborhood now the stage for a dramatic showdown between the formidable HOA president and the local law enforcement. As the reinforcements from the Oakwood Hills HOA began to gather, the tension in the air was palpable. Karen stood at the center of the growing crowd, her eyes scanning the faces of her fellow residents with a mixture of triumph and desperation. "All right, everyone, listen up," she bellowed through the megaphone. "We have a serious breach of our community's rules, and it is our duty as responsible homeowners to take action." The HOA members murmured in agreement, their expressions a mix of confusion and determination. Susan, sensing the impending clash, tried to interject. "Karen, this is getting out of hand. Can't we just talk this through and find a reasonable solution?" she pleaded, her voice barely audible over the din of the crowd. But Karen was having none of it. "There's no talking, Susan," she snapped, her eyes blazing with fury. "This is about upholding the integrity of our community, and I will not back down." The police chief, flanked by his newly arrived backup, stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of calm. "All right, everyone, let's all just take a deep breath and try to." Before he could finish his sentence, Karen cut him off, her voice shrill and uncompromising. "Chief, with all due respect, this is an internal matter for the HOA. We have our own rules and procedures, and we intend to enforce them, with or without your cooperation." The crowd erupted in a chorus of agreement, their voices rising in a cacophony of protest. Connor, sensing the impending clash, tried to push his way through the crowd, his eyes wide with concern. "Mom, please, this is getting out of hand," he pleaded, his voice barely audible over the din. But Karen was oblivious to her son's pleas, her focus entirely on the task at hand. She turned to the gathered HOA members, her expression grim. "All right, everyone, you know what to do. Let's show these rule breakers that we mean business." With those words, the HOA members surged forward, their faces set with a determined expression. The police chief, realizing the situation was rapidly escalating, stepped in front of the advancing crowd, his hands raised in a gesture of defiance. "Hold it right there, everyone," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This is a lawful order. I'm going to have to ask you all to stand down and disperse immediately." The standoff had begun, and the fate of the Oakwood Hills community hung in the balance. As the police chief stood his ground, the HOA members hesitated, their momentum momentarily stalled. Karen, her face flushed with fury, pushed her way to the front of the crowd, the megaphone clutched tightly in her hand. "This is an unlawful interference in the affairs of the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association," she bellowed, her voice crackling with a mix of desperation and defiance. "We have the right to enforce our own rules and regulations, and we will not be intimidated by the authorities." The police chief, his expression stern, stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered sidearm. "Mom, I'm going to have to ask you and your group to disperse immediately. You're disrupting the peace and potentially breaking the law." Karen's eyes narrowed, and she raised the megaphone to her lips once more. "Residents of Oakwood Hills, do not be swayed by the chief's empty threats. We are the guardians of this community, and we will not back down." The HOA members erupted in a chorus of cheers and applause, their enthusiasm fueling Karen's resolve. Sensing the growing tension, Connor pushed his way through the crowd, his face etched with a mixture of fear and desperation. "Mom, please, this has gone too far," he pleaded, his voice barely audible over the din. "Can't you see that you're putting everyone in danger?" But Karen was oblivious to her son's pleas, her attention focused entirely on the standoff with the police. Suddenly, a scuffle broke out at the edge of the crowd, and the sound of a scuffle echoed through the air. The police chief, his expression hardening, raised his hand, his voice booming over the chaos. "All right, that's it. Everyone, you're all under arrest for unlawful assembly and resisting arrest." As the police officers moved in to apprehend the HOA members, the crowd erupted in a panicked frenzy, with people pushing and shoving in a desperate attempt to escape. In the midst of the chaos, Karen found herself separated from her son, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. "This isn't over, Chief," she shouted, her voice hoarse from the megaphone. "You haven't heard the last of the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association." The standoff had reached a critical point, and the fate of the community hung in the balance. As the police officers began to apprehend the HOA members, the chaos in the Oakwood Hills Community Center reached a fever pitch. Karen, her eyes wild with desperation, fought against the officers' attempts to detain her, her shrill voice echoing through the air. "This is an outrage. You have no right to interfere in the affairs of our association," she shrieked, her megaphone forgotten at her feet. Connor, caught in the middle of the melee, tried in vain to reach his mother, his face etched with a mixture of fear and concern. "Mom, please, you have to stop this," he pleaded, his voice barely audible over the din. But Karen was oblivious to her son's pleas, her focus entirely on the confrontation with the police. She thrashed and struggled, her carefully coiffed hair now disheveled and her designer blouse wrinkled. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the chaos, its tone commanding and authoritative. "What in the world is going on here?" All eyes turned towards the source of the voice, and a collective hush fell over the crowd. There, striding towards the scene with a determined gait, was none other than the mayor of Oakwood Hills himself. Karen's eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment she seemed to falter, her bravado faltering in the face of the mayor's presence. Mr. Mayor," she stammered, these officers are interfering with the lawful activities of the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association." The mayor raised a hand, silencing Karen with a stern look. "I'm well aware of the situation, Mrs. Walters. In fact, I received a call from the police chief himself, informing me of your actions." He turned to the police chief, his expression grave. "Chief, what seemed to be the problem here?" The police chief, his uniform neatly pressed and his demeanor calm, stepped forward. "Mayor, these residents were engaging in an unlawful assembly and resisting arrest. We had no choice but to intervene." The mayor nodded, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "I see. And what, pray tell, was the nature of this assembly?" "Karen, sensing an opportunity to plead her case, stepped forward, her voice tinged with a hint of desperation. "Mr. Mayor, we were simply trying to enforce the rules and regulations of the Oakwood Hills Homeowners Association. These rule breakers were disrupting the peace and order of our community." The mayor's brow furrowed, and he turned to the police chief. "Chief, do these claims have any merit?" The police chief hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting between Karen and the gathered residents. "Well, sir, from what I could gather, the residents were engaged in a bit of harmless fun when Mrs. Walters decided to intervene." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the mayor raised a hand, silencing her. "That's enough, Mrs. Walters. I think it's time we had a little chat, don't you?" The tension in the air was palpable as the mayor led Karen away, leaving the residents of Oakwood Hills to grapple with the aftermath of the dramatic confrontation. As the mayor escorted Karen away, the residents of Oakwood Hills found themselves in a state of stunned silence. The once peaceful community had been torn apart by the actions of its self-appointed HOA president, and the consequences of her misguided zeal were becoming increasingly clear. Connor, his face still etched with a mixture of fear and concern, watched helplessly as his mother was led away by the mayor. He couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt and responsibility, knowing that his mother's obsession with the HOA had spiraled out of control. Susan, the HOA treasurer, approached Connor, her expression one of empathy and understanding. "Connor, I'm so sorry you had to witness all of this," she said, her voice soft and gentle. "Your mother, she's just so determined to maintain control, even when it means jeopardizing the well-being of our community." Connor nodded, his gaze fixed on the retreating figures of his mother and the mayor. "I know Susan. I've tried to reason with her, but she just won't listen. She's convinced that she's the only one who can keep this place in order." Susan sighed, placing a comforting hand on Connor's shoulder. "I understand, Connor, but you have to know that this isn't your fault. Your mother's actions are her own, and she'll have to face the consequences." The police chief, his expression somber, approached the pair, his hands resting on his belt. "Son, I'm sorry you had to be caught up in all of this," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Your mother's deal for the HOA has gotten out of hand, and I'm afraid she's going to have to answer for it." Connor looked up at his father, his eyes filled with a mix of emotions. "Dad, do you think she'll be okay? I mean," the mayor looked pretty angry. The police chief shook his head slowly. "I can't say for sure, Connor, but I can tell you that the mayor is a fair and reasonable man. He'll likely give your mother a chance to explain herself and try to find a way to resolve this situation." As the residents began to disperse, the weight of the day's events seemed to settle over the community. It was clear that Oakwood Hills would never be the same, and that the fallout from Karen's actions would reverberate for some time to come. But even amidst the turmoil, there was a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this ordeal would serve as a wake-up call, a chance for the residents to come together and reclaim the sense of community that had once defined their neighborhood. In the aftermath of the dramatic confrontation at the Oakwood Hills Community Center, the residents found themselves at a crossroads. The once tightly knit community had been torn apart by the actions of the HOA president, Karen Walters, and the reverberations of her misguided zeal were still being felt. As Karen sat in the mayor's office, her demeanor a stark contrast to the fiery determination she had displayed earlier, she found herself forced to confront the consequences of her actions. "Mrs. Walters, I must say, I'm quite disappointed in your behavior today," the mayor said, his voice stern but measured. "You seem to have forgotten that the role of the HOA is to serve the community, not to dictate its every move." Karen, her eyes downcast, struggled to find the words to defend herself. "But, Mr. Mayor, I was only trying to uphold the integrity of our neighborhood. The rules are there for a reason, and the mayor raised a hand, silencing her. "The rules are there to create a sense of order and community, not to be wielded as a weapon against your own neighbors. Your actions today have only served to divide and antagonize the very people you claim to represent." Karen felt the weight of the mayor's words settle upon her, and a pang of guilt and shame washed over her. For the first time, she truly saw the impact of her single-minded pursuit of control and the realization that she had jeopardized the very fabric of the community she claimed to protect. I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor, she whispered, her voice trembling. I never meant for things to spiral so out of control. I was just trying to do what I thought was best for Oakwood Hills. The mayor nodded, his expression softening slightly. I understand, Mrs. Walters, but the path to a thriving community is not paved with iron-fisted rule and blind obedience. It requires empathy, compromise, and a genuine respect for the diverse needs and perspectives of your neighbors. Karen sat in silence, her mind reeling as the mayor's words sank in. In that moment, she realized the gravity of her mistakes and the damage she had inflicted upon the very community she had sworn to protect. As she emerged from the mayor's office, her shoulders slumped and her once pristine appearance disheveled, Karen knew that her days as the HOA president were likely coming to an end. But in the midst of her humiliation, she also found a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild the trust she had so carelessly shattered, and to rediscover the true meaning of community. The residents of Oakwood Hills, in the wake of the dramatic shutdown, found themselves at a crossroads as well. Some were eager to move on, to put the past behind them and return to the peaceful, harmonious existence they had once known. Others, however, saw this as an opportunity to reshape the community, to forge a new path that prioritized empathy, collaboration, and a shared sense of belonging. As the sun set in the embattled neighborhood, the stage was set for a new chapter in the life of Oakwood Hills, one that would test the resilience and adaptability of its residents, and perhaps, in the end, lead to a stronger, more united community.